The bells of Ashcombe Parish had scarcely finished their jubilant peal before whispers outran them through every drawing room, market square, and ivy-covered lane in the county. After 15 years of mournful prayers and faded memorials, Duke Alistair Ashcombe had returned alive. The impossible had stepped ashore from a naval vessel under a grey October sky, carrying little more than a weathered trunk, a scar across his brow, and memories that no gentleman should have been forced to keep. England celebrated a miracle, yet every miracle invited another story, and before sunset the oldest servants of Ashcombe Hall had begun exchanging uneasy glances over silver trays and polished floors. The great house awakened as though it had been sleeping for years. Chandeliers glittered above marble halls, footmen hurried through endless corridors, and gardeners gathered the last crimson roses before the frost claimed them. Noble families arrived in polished carriages, eager to witness the reunion history itself had denied. Ladies adjusted jeweled gloves while gentlemen rehearsed solemn words of welcome, though curiosity gleamed more brightly than sympathy in many careful smiles. Everyone wished to see whether love could truly survive 15 years of silence, or whether absence had buried it beside the countless names engraved upon forgotten memorial stones. Among the arriving guests moved Lady Beatrice Winthrop with effortless elegance, her emerald gown shimmering beneath candlelight like polished glass. She accepted every greeting with gracious composure while quietly planting poisonous seeds into willing ears. A lowered voice here, a sorrowful sigh there, and the rumor blossomed without resistance. The Duchess, they whispered, was expecting a child. Not the Duke's child, of course, for the Duke had been believed dead. By the time musicians tuned their violins, the scandal had become accepted truth among people who preferred certainty over compassion. No whisper escaped the walls entirely. Eleanor Ashcombe heard fragments as they drifted beneath heavy oak doors and floated through curtained passages. She stood alone inside the blue drawing-room, one hand resting protectively upon the gentle curve beneath her gown. Her face retained the quiet beauty that had once inspired poets at court, though years of loneliness had softened youthful brightness into patient dignity. She neither denied the gossip nor surrendered to it. Instead, she lifted her chin with calm resolve, as though enduring judgment had become another household duty alongside balancing ledgers and comforting frightened tenants through cruel winters. 15 years had transformed her into something stronger than the bride Alistair remembered. During endless seasons without word from her husband, she had buried loyal servants, reopened abandoned schools, sold family jewels to buy bread, and greeted every dawn without surrendering to despair. Society had praised her resilience while believing her a widow, yet now the same society sharpened its appetite for disgrace. The child she protected had become a weapon in strangers' mouths before drawing its first innocent breath. Outside, wheels ground across wet gravel. The long-awaited carriage crossed beneath Ashcombe's ancient stone archway. Stable boys hurried forward as liveried footmen formed perfect lines despite trembling hands. When the carriage door finally opened, silence settled with astonishing force. Duke Alistair Ashcombe stepped onto familiar ground looking older than his 40 years, his broad shoulders carrying invisible burdens heavier than travel trunks. Deep lines framed thoughtful eyes that had witnessed distant wars, imprisonment, and survival. He paused before the towering manor, studying every familiar window as though expecting ghosts instead of home. The steward approached with tears glistening upon weathered cheeks, yet Alistair noticed something stranger than joyful emotion. Faces turned away too quickly. Conversations died unfinished. Even embraces felt hesitant. Celebration lingered uneasily beneath a veil of concealed dread. Every instinct refined through years of hardship warned him that Ashcombe Hall guarded a truth no welcoming banquet could disguise. Inside the entrance hall, portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from gilded frames while servants bowed with practiced reverence. Alistair accepted their greetings gently, asking familiar names, remembering children now grown into adults. Yet behind every smile hid another unreadable expression, pity mingled with apprehension. Before he could question anyone, Lady Beatrice approached, offering perfect courtesy wrapped around carefully measured sorrow. "My dear Duke," she murmured, lowering her gaze with exquisite restraint, "I pray your strength proves equal to what awaits you." Before Alistair could demand an explanation, the ballroom doors opened. Candlelight poured across polished floors where hundreds of guests parted in stunned silence. At the far end stood Eleanor, radiant despite exhaustion, one protective hand resting upon the unmistakable curve beneath her gown. Time itself seemed to stop between them. He searched her face for betrayal, grief, hope, anything that resembled the wife he had kissed goodbye 15 years before. She met his gaze without flinching, though unshed tears shimmered in her steady eyes. The grandfather clock struck once. Then, with heartbreaking calm, Alistair asked, "Whose child does my wife carry?" Eleanor drew one trembling breath before answering softly, "A child I promised heaven I would protect." Silence answered her. The silence that followed Eleanor's quiet answer lingered long after the orchestra lowered its instruments and the guests remembered how to breathe. No accusation escaped Alistair's lips, yet no reassurance softened his expression. Society had expected rage, perhaps even banishment before the assembled nobility. Instead, the Duke merely bowed with restrained courtesy and withdrew from the ballroom, leaving behind a gathering that erupted into whispers more venomous than before. Eleanor remained where she stood, her dignity becoming the only shield she possessed against hundreds of curious eyes determined to interpret her silence as guilt. That restless night, rain tapped gently against Ashcombe Hall's tall windows while memories returned to Eleanor with painful clarity. Long before the miraculous news of Alistair's survival reached England, she had lived as a widow in everything except law. Every sunrise had begun with duty rather than hope. Estate ledgers covered her writing desk beside unanswered letters addressed to distant military offices. Servants looked to her for certainty, tenants depended upon her compassion, and every decision rested upon shoulders that had once expected only partnership, never solitary command. The harsh winter of the previous year had nearly broken the surrounding villages. Snow buried roads for weeks, livestock perished beneath frozen winds, and fever spread through humble cottages with relentless cruelty. Eleanor visited homes personally, carrying blankets, medicines, and food purchased by quietly selling another treasured necklace from the Ashcombe collection. She refused public praise, insisting that a noble title existed to serve those with fewer blessings. Her kindness became legendary among the poor, though the aristocracy scarcely noticed sacrifices hidden beyond polished drawing rooms. One bitter evening, the village physician, Thomas Hawthorne, arrived at Ashcombe Hall with exhaustion carved deeply across his gentle face. Mud stained his boots, and grief dimmed the quiet intelligence within his eyes. He requested a private audience, explaining only that the matter involved life, death, and an innocent soul with no protector remaining. Eleanor welcomed him into the library, where the fire crackled softly against the bitter darkness gathering beyond stained glass windows. Thomas spoke with visible restraint. His younger brother, William, and William's beloved wife had both fallen victim to the fever sweeping the countryside. The young woman had entered premature labor moments before death claimed her, and through desperate effort the infant survived while both parents slipped beyond earthly suffering. Before breathing his last, William had grasped Thomas's trembling hand and whispered a plea more powerful than any legal testament. Powerful relatives intended to seize the child and control the inheritance left through the mother's family. If they succeeded, the infant would become little more than a living signature upon valuable property. Eleanor listened without interruption, feeling every measured word settle heavily upon her conscience. Thomas admitted he possessed neither wealth nor influence capable of shielding the child against ambitious noblemen skilled in manipulating courts and guardianship laws. The infant required protection beyond affection alone. He needed a name no predator dared challenge. He needed the shelter of Ashcombe, where ancient authority still carried weight across every courtroom in England. For several long moments, only the fire disturbed the silence. Eleanor understood immediately what Thomas lacked the courage to request outright. If the child disappeared into Ashcombe Hall beneath the protection of the Duchess herself, greedy claimants would hesitate before provoking one of England's oldest houses. Yet such protection demanded a deception almost impossible to sustain. Society would ask questions no truthful answer could safely satisfy. Respectability would wither beneath relentless suspicion. Her own honor would become the price of preserving another family's future. She walked toward the frosted window and gazed across sleeping fields silvered beneath moonlight. 15 years earlier, Alistair had promised that courage often required choosing the loneliest road. She remembered those words with aching precision. Turning back toward Thomas, she accepted the burden without seeking praise or reassurance. The child would become her responsibility before the world, though only heaven and a handful of trusted souls would know the truth. Thomas fell to one knee, overcome by gratitude, while Eleanor gently urged him to rise, reminding him that no innocent life should ever depend upon pride. The deception began quietly. Extra linens appeared within unused nursery rooms. Trusted servants prepared discreetly while the physician arranged every practical detail. Eleanor altered her gowns with careful simplicity, allowing natural assumptions to spread unchallenged. She neither confirmed nor denied whispered speculation. Every cruel glance she received became another invisible stone laid upon the fortress protecting the helpless child. Lady Beatrice noticed the growing rumors almost immediately. Rather than question their origin, she cultivated them with exquisite calculation. Anonymous notes appeared inside fashionable salons hinting at secret meetings between Eleanor and Thomas. Forged correspondence soon followed, describing imaginary affection between the lonely Duchess and the widowed physician. Each fabrication traveled farther than truth ever could, because scandal entertained hearts that compassion rarely reached. Eleanor endured every insult without retaliation. She attended church with serene composure while strangers lowered their voices as she passed. Invitations quietly disappeared. Former friends offered sympathetic smiles that concealed eager judgment. Even loyal servants suffered humiliation merely through association with their mistress. Still, she refused to reveal the dying father's plea, believing broken reputation a smaller sacrifice than broken trust. Days after Alistair's return, unable to sleep beneath the crushing weight of uncertainty, he wandered through rooms preserved exactly as he had left them. Hidden within Eleanor's private sitting room stood a small velvet box resting beside a faded prayer book. Inside lay his wedding ring, carefully polished despite 15 years of absence, accompanied by a folded note written in his own unmistakable hand before departing for war. As candlelight trembled across the page, he slowly read the forgotten promise, "Whatever the world believes of you, I pray I never doubt your heart." His hands began to shake as footsteps paused outside the unopened door. Morning arrived beneath a veil of silver mist that clung to the fields surrounding Ashcombe Hall like lingering uncertainty. Alistair had scarcely slept after discovering the folded note inside the velvet box. Its familiar handwriting haunted him more deeply than Eleanor's guarded reply in the ballroom. He had written those words as a young husband preparing to leave for distant service, believing faith would be easier than separation. 15 years of suffering had hardened his body, yet the promise of trusting her heart now accused him more sharply than any stranger's condemnation ever could. Instead of confronting Eleanor again, he resolved to search for truth where gossip could not follow. Without announcing his intentions, the Duke rode alone into the neighboring villages. Autumn winds carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke while golden leaves drifted across quiet roads once traveled by his younger self. Everywhere he expected whispers of disgrace, yet he encountered something entirely different. An elderly blacksmith removed his cap with heartfelt respect and thanked heaven for the Duke's safe return before speaking warmly of the Duchess. A widow clasped Alistair's hands with grateful tears, explaining that Eleanor had secretly paid her debts after a devastating fire consumed her cottage. At a modest schoolhouse built beside the parish church, children recited their lessons beneath a carved stone bearing no family crest, though the headmistress quietly confessed that every brick had been purchased through anonymous donations from Ashcombe Hall. Each story unsettled him more than the last. Villagers remembered no grand speeches or public ceremonies. They spoke instead of quiet visits during storms, baskets of bread left outside hungry homes before dawn, blankets delivered without names attached, and medicines appearing whenever illness threatened the poorest families. Eleanor had accepted neither applause nor recognition. She had served with such humility that many beneficiaries discovered her generosity only years afterward. Alistair realized the estate he had feared ruined had survived because his absent title had been carried by a woman whose strength had flourished in silence rather than privilege. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the countryside, the Duke arrived at the modest stone cottage belonging to Thomas Hawthorne. Ivy climbed its weathered walls, and late roses still bloomed beside the narrow gate despite the cooling season. Thomas emerged carrying a basket of herbs, his face paling the instant he recognized his unexpected visitor. For one suspended moment neither man spoke. Then, to Alistair's astonishment, the physician set aside the basket, removed his hat, and lowered himself onto one knee. "My Grace," Thomas said quietly, "I have prayed every day that you would return before it became too late." Alistair stared at him with measured caution. Every rumor had painted this man as a secret lover and willing betrayer. Instead he found only exhausted sincerity. He gently motioned for Thomas to rise and accepted the invitation into the humble cottage. Inside, shelves overflowed with medical books, dried herbs, and neatly arranged bottles rather than luxuries. A small fire crackled within the hearth, filling the room with warmth that contrasted sharply against the cold suspicion lingering in the Duke's heart. Thomas poured tea with steady hands before speaking again. He described William's final illness exactly as he had once described it to Eleanor, sparing no painful detail. He recounted the desperate childbirth, the dying father's plea, and the ruthless relatives determined to seize both the infant and the inheritance attached to the child's mother's bloodline. Every memory carried the weight of genuine grief rather than rehearsed defense. Finally he opened a small oak chest resting beneath the table and withdrew a sealed packet wrapped carefully in faded linen. "This belonged to my brother," Thomas whispered. "He begged that it reach only the man worthy of knowing why your Duchess chose disgrace over comfort." Alistair accepted the packet with reluctant hands. Inside rested William's final letter, written in trembling script stained by tears and failing strength. The dying father begged whoever protected his unborn child never to reveal the truth until the danger had passed, fearing powerful relatives would stop at nothing to secure their fortune. The letter praised Eleanor's courage before she had even accepted the burden, calling her the only lady whose honor is greater than her title. Each sentence stripped another layer from the Duke's certainty until shame settled heavily upon his conscience. He looked toward Thomas, whose eyes reflected years of silent gratitude and unspoken sorrow. The physician confessed that Eleanor had insisted upon carrying the entire scandal herself. She had forbidden anyone from defending her publicly because every explanation endangered the child. She believed reputations could eventually heal, while innocent lives stolen by greed could never be restored. Thomas admitted he had argued against such sacrifice countless times, yet Eleanor never yielded. "She said a duchess must sometimes protect strangers as fiercely as family," he murmured. She considered the choice painfully simple. The Duke closed his eyes briefly, remembering Eleanor standing alone before hundreds of judging faces while he himself had questioned her with cold restraint. He recalled the lonely dignity in her expression and recognized it now for what it truly had been, not guilt but determined protection. Every whispered insult she had endured became another wound accepted willingly for someone too small to defend himself. The revelation left him humbled beyond words. Yet truth had enemies who refused to surrender quietly. Even as Alistair departed the cottage carrying William's letter beneath his coat, a rider galloped toward Ashcombe Hall bearing sealed documents prepared in Lady Beatrice's private study. Forged diaries, fabricated correspondence, and sworn statements purchased with generous bribes accused Eleanor of prolonged adultery and deliberate deception. Lord Cedric ensured copies reached influential officials before sunset, demanding an immediate investigation worthy of parliamentary attention. By evening the scandal had escaped county gossip and entered the highest circles of the kingdom. When Alistair returned home, the household waited in uneasy silence. A royal messenger stood beneath the great staircase holding a crimson-sealed decree. Bowing formally, he announced that, by order of the Crown, an official inquiry would determine whether the Duchess of Ashcombe had dishonored her marriage and forfeited every right to her title. Across the hall, Eleanor met her husband's gaze with calm acceptance rather than fear, while hidden beneath his coat William's final letter suddenly felt less like proof of innocence than the last fragile shield standing between justice and irreversible ruin. The morning of the inquiry dawned beneath a pale sky that seemed unwilling to brighten over Ashcombe Hall. Thick mist curled across the ancient lawns, softening statues and hedgerows until the great estate resembled a memory rather than a home. Long before the appointed hour, elegant carriages crowded the gravel drive, delivering peers of the realm, senior clergymen, barristers, magistrates, and members of Parliament. Journalists waited outside the gates with sharpened pencils, eager to witness the scandal that had already captured the imagination of the entire kingdom. England had come expecting to watch a duchess fall. Inside the great hall, every candle burned despite the daylight, their golden flames reflecting from polished marble and towering mirrors. The magnificent chamber that had once hosted wedding celebrations and harvest banquets had been transformed into a solemn tribunal. Portraits of generations of Ashcombe ancestors gazed silently from gilded walls, as though judging both the living and the dead. At the center stood Eleanor, dressed in a simple dove-gray gown devoid of jewels. She carried herself with quiet grace, refusing to disguise either her exhaustion or the gentle curve beneath her gown. She looked neither like a guilty woman nor a triumphant one. She looked like someone who had spent years carrying burdens too sacred to abandon. Alistair entered moments later, dressed in formal black, his expression composed but unreadable. He felt countless eyes following him as he crossed the chamber, yet he ignored every curious glance until he reached Eleanor's side. For a brief instant their hands nearly touched. Neither dared close the final inch separating them, but the hesitation itself revealed more tenderness than any public embrace could have done. At the opposite end of the hall, Lady Beatrice Winthrop appeared with flawless confidence. Her mourning-colored silk and carefully restrained expression suggested reluctant duty rather than satisfaction. Beside her stood Lord Cedric Winthrop, carrying a leather portfolio secured with crimson ribbons. Together they presented the image of respectable witnesses determined to defend morality, though ambition gleamed beneath their polished manners. The presiding magistrate called the assembly to order. Silence spread through the chamber with almost physical weight. Cedric stepped forward first, placing forged letters upon the polished table one by one. Each page described imaginary meetings between Eleanor and Thomas Hawthorne. Carefully fabricated diary entries hinted at forbidden affection, while false witnesses repeated rehearsed stories of secret carriage rides and stolen conversations. Every accusation sounded plausible because it had been designed to satisfy the public appetite for betrayal rather than truth. Each document drew murmurs from the gathered audience. Reporters scribbled feverishly. Several noblewomen lowered their eyes in disappointment, already convinced that the Duchess's silence confirmed every allegation. Throughout the proceedings, Eleanor neither interrupted nor protested. She listened calmly, her hands folded before her, refusing to defend herself with words that would expose the child entrusted to her care. The magistrate finally addressed her directly. "Your Grace, these accusations carry grave consequences. If you possess evidence capable of clearing your name, this court urges you to present it." Eleanor lifted her gaze with quiet dignity. "I possess truth," she answered softly, "but it was entrusted to me by the dying. I cannot betray that trust merely to preserve my own reputation." Confusion rippled across the chamber. The magistrate frowned. "You understand that your silence may cost you everything?" "I understood that from the moment I made my promise." Her reply stunned even those who doubted her innocence. She spoke without bitterness, fear, or self-pity. She accepted the possibility of disgrace as though protecting another soul remained infinitely more important than protecting herself. Lady Beatrice recognized the dangerous shift in the room. Sympathy had begun replacing suspicion. She rose dramatically, insisting that only guilty people hid behind noble-sounding sacrifices. Producing another sealed envelope, she claimed it contained undeniable proof that Eleanor had confessed her affair in private correspondence. Before the document could be read, Alistair stepped forward. "No." The single word echoed through the vast chamber. For the first time since his return, the Duke spoke not as a wounded husband but as a man confronting his own failures. "I have listened to accusations against my wife," he said steadily. "Now you shall hear one against me." Every voice fell silent. "I left England believing I would soon return. Instead, fate imprisoned me for 15 years while Eleanor stood alone against responsibilities that belonged to us both. She buried our friends, protected our people, preserved my house, and carried my name with honor while I offered her nothing except absence. If hardship forced impossible choices upon her, then I bear equal responsibility for every burden she carried." He turned toward Eleanor, emotion finally breaking through years of restraint. "I questioned her before I questioned the rumors. That failure will shame me for the remainder of my life." Many who had arrived expecting spectacle now lowered their heads in quiet reflection. Thomas Hawthorne was summoned next. He entered carrying the oak chest that had remained hidden for months. With trembling reverence, he produced William Hawthorne's final letter together with medical records documenting the tragic birth and the deaths of the infant's parents. The parish midwife followed, confirming every detail under oath. 2 elderly nurses testified that Eleanor had personally arranged the child's protection while refusing every suggestion that would have cleared her own name. One witness after another dismantled the Winthrops' elaborate deception until the forged evidence appeared pitiful beside the overwhelming weight of truth. The magistrate ordered Cedric's documents examined immediately. Within minutes, handwriting experts identified inconsistencies. Wax seals had been copied imperfectly. Dates contradicted parish records. Paid witnesses faltered under questioning, their carefully memorized stories collapsing into frightened contradictions. Lady Beatrice's elegant composure shattered. Desperation replaced confidence. She accused Thomas of conspiracy. She accused the servants of loyalty purchased with favors. Finally, she accused Eleanor herself of manipulating everyone's compassion. Eleanor simply looked at her with quiet sadness. "I never wished for your humiliation," she said gently. "I only wished for one innocent child to live without fear." Those words carried greater force than any condemnation. The magistrate rose, declaring the forged evidence fraudulent and ordering Lord Cedric Winthrop arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempting to corrupt judicial proceedings. Officers stepped forward as gasps swept through the chamber. Lady Beatrice staggered backward, realizing that every ambition she had pursued for 15 years had collapsed within a single afternoon. Then, before anyone could speak again, Alistair crossed the marble floor and stopped before Eleanor. Ignoring rank, custom, and every expectation of Victorian pride, the Duke slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The entire hall watched in stunned silence. Looking up at the woman he had loved, doubted, and finally understood, he said in a voice that reached every corner of the chamber, "Your Grace, I cannot ask forgiveness for the years that were stolen from us, nor for the wound my doubt placed upon your faithful heart. But if there remains even the smallest place for me beside you, will you allow me to spend the rest of my life earning again the trust one failed to keep?" Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes as she reached toward him, her trembling hand hovering only inches from his, while every soul in the hall held its breath, waiting to discover whether a love tested by 15 years of silence, and one terrible moment of doubt, could still be strong enough to begin again. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic, as though nature itself wished to erase the harshness of the winter that had settled over so many wounded hearts. The ancient oaks unfurled tender green leaves, roses climbed once more across weathered stone walls, and the gardens Eleanor had patiently restored during years of solitude burst into fragrant bloom. Where whispers of disgrace had once drifted through every corridor, laughter now mingled with bird-song, carrying a warmth the great house had not known since before Alistair's departure. The Crown's official judgment spread across England with astonishing speed. Every charge against Eleanor Ashcombe was dismissed in full, while the inquiry praised her extraordinary courage in protecting an orphan child at tremendous personal cost. Newspapers that had eagerly printed scandal now filled their front pages with words of admiration and regret. Some editors openly confessed that they had mistaken silence for guilt and sacrifice for deception. Yet Eleanor never celebrated her vindication. She accepted every apology with quiet grace, believing that bitterness would only continue the suffering she had spent years trying to end. Lord Cedric Winthrop faced conviction for fraud, conspiracy, and the deliberate fabrication of evidence intended to destroy an innocent woman. His carefully woven web of lies unraveled before the courts exactly as it had before the inquiry. Lady Beatrice, stripped of both influence and social standing, withdrew from fashionable society altogether. Many expected Eleanor to demand harsh punishment or public humiliation for the woman who had devoted 15 years to destroying her reputation. Instead, she requested only that no further cruelty be shown. "Hatred," she told Alistair one peaceful evening, "has already stolen too many years from every soul it touched. I would rather end its journey than continue it." Those simple words revealed a greatness no title could bestow. Alistair spent the following weeks confronting the silence he had carried within himself for 15 long years. Every familiar room in Ashcombe Hall reminded him of the husband he had once hoped to become and the man circumstance had prevented him from being. He walked through the nursery Eleanor had quietly prepared, the village school she had financed, the cottages she had restored, and the chapel where she had prayed faithfully for his safe return long after others had surrendered hope. Everywhere he turned, he discovered evidence of a woman who had chosen compassion whenever life offered easier paths. One afternoon he found Eleanor sitting beneath the ancient cedar overlooking the western gardens. Sunlight filtered gently through the branches while she cradled the sleeping infant whose future had demanded such remarkable sacrifice. The child rested peacefully against her shoulder, utterly unaware that his existence had tested the honor of an entire kingdom. Alistair approached slowly before kneeling beside her. "I have spent years wondering whether I survived for a reason," he said quietly. "Now I believe that reason was not to reclaim my old life, but to become worthy of the one you preserved." Eleanor looked toward him with gentle sadness. "You owe me no punishment beyond the sorrow you already carry. I owe you something greater than regret." She remained silent. "I owe you a husband who finally understands what love truly requires." For the first time since his return, Eleanor reached for his hand without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined with quiet certainty, neither attempting to erase the years they had lost nor pretending those years had not changed them. They simply accepted that love, when rooted deeply enough, could survive even the longest winters. Within days, the final legal proceedings surrounding William Hawthorne's son were completed. The dying father's wishes were honored exactly as he had hoped. The child was formally adopted into the Ashcombe family under the protection of both the Duke and Duchess, ensuring that neither greedy relatives nor ambitious opportunists would ever threaten his future again. Thomas Hawthorne accepted the arrangement with grateful tears, promising to remain a constant presence in the boy's life while honoring Eleanor as the woman who had saved him before he had drawn his first peaceful breath. Preparations soon began for a celebration unlike any Ashcombe Hall had ever hosted. It would not commemorate military victories, noble titles, or profitable marriages. Instead, Eleanor insisted the gathering honor every act of quiet kindness that had sustained the estate through years of hardship. Invitations reached villagers alongside dukes, schoolchildren beside bishops, physicians beside parliamentarians. For one extraordinary afternoon, rank mattered less than character. The gardens shimmered beneath hundreds of white blossoms as guests wandered among musicians, flowering arches, and long tables filled with simple yet elegant meals prepared from the surrounding countryside. Children raced freely across lawns where aristocrats once demanded solemn decorum. Elderly tenants embraced servants as equals. Laughter replaced judgment. Gratitude replaced suspicion. As evening settled over the estate, lanterns illuminated every pathway like countless tiny stars descended upon the earth. Alistair stepped onto the broad stone terrace overlooking the assembled gathering. Beside him stood Eleanor, holding the child whose innocent life had transformed so many others. The Duke waited until complete silence embraced the gardens. "When I returned," he began, "I believed I had come home to discover betrayal. Instead, I discovered courage beyond anything I had witnessed on any battlefield." His gaze settled lovingly upon Eleanor. "For 15 years, this remarkable woman protected not merely my house, but its very soul. She accepted loneliness without complaint, disgrace without bitterness, and sacrifice without expectation of reward. Many believed noble blood created greatness. They were mistaken." He gently lifted the child into his arms. "This little life taught me that family is never measured solely by blood. It is measured by every promise faithfully kept, every burden willingly shared, and every act of love performed when no audience is watching." A profound stillness settled across the gardens. Then Alistair reached into the inner pocket of his coat. From a velvet box he withdrew the wedding ring Eleanor had preserved through every lonely year of his absence. The gold caught the lantern light exactly as it had on their wedding day. He turned toward her. 15 years ago, he said softly enough that only those nearest could hear, "I placed this ring upon your hand believing I understood devotion. I was young enough to mistake promises for proof. Today I ask for something entirely different." He gently took her trembling hand. "I ask permission to spend every remaining day proving the vow I once spoke too easily." With infinite care, he slipped the ring back onto her finger. Tears glistened upon Eleanor's cheeks, yet her smile carried neither triumph nor relief. It carried peace. She looked into his eyes and answered with a quiet certainty that had sustained her through every trial. "I forgave you long before you returned. I simply prayed you would one day forgive yourself." The words broke the final wall around Alistair's heart. He embraced her beneath the flowering trees while applause dissolved into joyful tears throughout the gathered crowd. Years passed gently over Ashcombe Hall after that unforgettable evening. The orphan child grew surrounded not by whispers of scandal but by stories of extraordinary kindness. He learned that courage often appeared in silence rather than speeches, that honor sometimes demanded misunderstanding, and that love became strongest when tested by sacrifice instead of comfort. Thomas Hawthorne remained a beloved uncle within the household, while the schools, clinics, and charitable homes Eleanor founded continued to flourish across the county. Travelers from distant counties began speaking of Ashcombe not as the estate once marked by scandal, but as the house where abandoned children always found refuge and where no hungry family was ever turned away. The Duke and Duchess quietly expanded Eleanor's charitable work, transforming forgotten cottages into homes, neglected fields into thriving farms, and lonely lives into hopeful futures. They sought no monuments, believing compassion itself to be the only legacy worth leaving. On a golden spring evening many years later, Alistair and Eleanor stood together beneath the same cedar tree where hope had first returned to them. Their adopted son laughed nearby with village children, never separating himself by rank or privilege. Watching him, Alistair smiled with peaceful gratitude. "I once believed fate stole 15 years from us," he whispered. Eleanor rested her head gently against his shoulder. "No," she replied. "It taught us that love is not measured by the years we keep, but by what we choose to do with the years we are given." The church bells echoed across the valley as the setting sun bathed Ashcombe Hall in warm golden light. The estate that had once been divided by suspicion now stood united by mercy, forgiveness, and unwavering devotion. The greatest scandal Victorian society had ever celebrated became the greatest lesson it would never forget. Titles could command respect, wealth could purchase comfort, and power could silence opposition. But only love, strengthened by sacrifice and sustained by trust, possessed the quiet strength to heal broken hearts, restore shattered honor, and transform strangers into family for generations yet to come.